over the ages, some changes in burial practices, and some changes in the way that certain people are choosing to view death today. Along the way, I'll also feature some works from our Death Salon writers and performers. So we'll start at the beginning. There is no medicine to be found for a life which has fled. You'll see here a list of some illustrious ancient names, and one of the more unusual things that they had in common was a fear of premature burial. This fear was very common in ancient times because so little was known about medicine that it was very hard to distinguish the line between the living and the dead. You might be surprised to know that although the reasons why have definitely changed, that line is still between life and death. It's just as murky as ever, and it's usually physicians who are the ones who have to make that call. We'll get back to that eventually, but with these ancients, in order to assuage their fears of premature burial, the ancient Greeks instituted a law that required that people wait 6 or 7 full days before burying a body thought to be dead. Now, waiting that long in days before refrigeration and embalming is practically unthinkable today, but it did achieve their main goal because if there was a dead body lying out for a week, you would definitely know that it was dead. But at least the Greeks furnished their wealthier dead with some beautiful sarcophagi that miraculously managed to survive to this day, though the bodies in them are long gone. Moving on to the Middle Ages, many important foundations for the tropes and images through which we view death were laid in the Middle Ages. It is, after all, the period of time that gave us Gothic art. Death in the Middle Ages was not a moment, it was a process. Besides the continually blurred lines between life and death, once you were buried, you didn't stay there forever. When your body had decayed for a few years, it was then moved to an ossuary or a charnel house, where bones were stacked and kept efficiently for perpetuity. Many such places still exist in Europe today. You can still visit these places. Most are rather modest, but some are rather grand, like this one. Your old grave would then be filled with a few more corpses until those became skeletons and could be moved to the charnel house. These photos are by Death Salon speaker Paul Kuneris. He's a local LA writer who's taken photos in ossuaries all over Europe. These last 2 images were from his book Empire of Death. And this latest one is from a book that's just coming out now called Heavenly Bodies, which focuses on the jeweled skeletons of some martyrs from around this time period in Germany and the surrounding areas. So that's going to be a really interesting talk, I think. And when we think of death in the Middle Ages, we think of the plague. And just one of the medieval plagues, from 1347 to 1348, that's 1 year, cut the population of Florence in half, from 100,000 to only 50,000. And despite this carnage between the 11th and 13th centuries, Latin Christendom in Europe doubled in population overall, and they began to live just slightly longer. As one historian put it, this shift put a meanwhile between the present and the apocalypse, whose impending arrival was not felt as strongly as in preceding centuries. This shift gave medieval Christians a little bit more time to think about how they were going to die, and gave rise to the concept of the good death. In a good death, the person would die at home, having been absolved of sin and taken in the last rites surrounded by loved ones. In a bad death, which was usually a sudden death, the dead did not get to confess or get the last rites, and it was believed that those would be sent to either purgatory or hell. Books called the Ars Moriendi, or Art of Dying, became popular at this time to give explicit instructions on achieving a good death. The past few images I've shown you have been from medieval Ars Moriendi, as is this one. In many ways, medieval Christians placed as much or more importance on the way that they died as compared to the way that they lived. And this was especially true of the saints. You'll see St. Vincent here on his rack. St. Sebastian you'll see in medieval art shot through with arrows. St. Agatha holding her severed breasts on a plate. Saints were often identified in medieval art not by the ways that they lived or their good deeds, but by the gruesome ways in which they were martyred. Author and USC alumni Colin Dickey, explores this angle in his latest book, Afterlives of the Saints, Stories from the Ends of Faith. In this book, Colin tells tales of the acts attributed to saints after their deaths and the people who revere them as patron saints. For instance, St. Jerome is the patron saint of librarians. St. Thomas More would eventually go on to be the patron saint of such very specific groups as difficult marriages, large families, and civil servants. Colin Dickey is one of the organizers of Death Salon LA and will be speaking there. The story of the afterlife of one medieval saint's body is particularly representative of how important saints' bodies were to medieval Christians. This tale is told in another Death Salon speaker, Bess Lovejoy's book, Rest in Pieces, The Curious Fates of Famous Corpses. St. Nicholas. Yes, that St. Nicholas lived in the first half of the 4th century in what is now Turkey. After his death, his body began to ooze myrrh, which is said to smell like roses and possess potent healing powers, which drew pilgrims to his tomb in Myra. Surrounding towns started to get jealous of all of this tourism and the money that it generated, so a group of merchants and sailors stole St. Nicholas's relics from Myra and brought them to Bari, Italy, where they're still a popular tourist attraction. Each May, during the Feast of the Translation, which means we translated these bones from another place to this place, a rector will put some of the myrrh from Nicholas's bones into a vial and mix it with holy water, and then is then sold in shops in Bari as a curative drink. Venice also lays claims to having St. Nicholas's bones, and this has been going on for centuries, and after some recent DNA testing, it was discovered that both Venice and Bari do have bones from the same person. As late as 2009, Turkey was considering petitioning Rome for the return of St. Nicholas to Myra, which is now called Demri. They claim that, although they lay claim to being the place where St. Nicholas lived, the empty tomb tends to disappoint the tourists, so they want it back. And as you can see, saints' bodies, now as they were in the Middle Ages, are big business. Moving on to the early modern era, early Dr. Sir Thomas Brown said, "We all labor against our own cure, for death is the cure of all diseases." As we emerged from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment, the length and quality of life did not appreciate considerably. As Thomas Hobbes notes in his famous quote, life is still pretty rough and brief for people in the early modern era. Also, our understanding of the line between life and death was still pretty shaky. Death was usually determined by a doctor listening for a heartbeat by putting his ear up to a chest, or holding a mirror to a dying person's mouth to see if their breath made it fog. Often for the very ill, they could fail both of these tests and still be very much alive. Death historian Ruth Richardson points out that at the time, a limber corpse, one which failed to show signs of stiffness, was an object of particular fear. Only rigor mortis and putrefaction were sure signs of death in this era, much like in the ancient times. Old age is the most unnatural cause of death in the early modern era. As Montaigne put it, it was not a favorable way to die either. To die of old age is a death rare, extraordinary, and singular, and therefore so much less natural than the others. It is the last and most extreme sort of dying, and the more remote, the less to be hoped for. And therefore, my opinion is that once 40 years old, we should consider it as an age to which very few arrive. For seeing that men do not usually proceed so far, it is a sign that we are pretty well advanced. And since we have exceeded the ordinary bounds which make the just measure of life, we ought not to expect to go much further. Montaigne's quote illustrates an important way that in early modern life, and indeed most other times in history, life is not expected to go on very long at all. When people have no expectation of living a long time, when death comes knocking, it might have been sad or cruel, but it was rarely shocking to anyone. Part of the modern culture of death denial, which I'll go into in greater detail later, is that because we expect to live so long, at the very least twice as long as Montaigne did, we don't know how to react when our life expectations are not met. So it's kind of depressing thought. So I think it might be a good time to take a break for a game. Yay, let's see if we can make this happen. Been in various years. So in 1647, you died of plague. Like I said, probably likely. You can also check out 1801, you died of whooping cough. You know, they call things, names slightly changed over time. Or you might die of consumption, pretty normal there. In 1769, early modern era, you died of teeth and worms. I don't know exactly how you would describe that, but it doesn't sound like a good way to go out. If you go ahead and fast forward to 1990, you would die of cancer, or heart disease, or cancer again, or all other accidents, and more heart disease. So, back to So, in our game here, it tells us a lot. You know, it's kind of fun, but also it's pretty germane to our talk today because you can see how different causes of death were different at different time periods. It also shows you how there are many things that would have killed you long ago, like the teeth and worms thing, that probably wouldn't kill you today, and how our sedentary lifestyles contribute to our most common causes of death today. It's just all heart disease, diabetes, mellitus, that kind of thing. When we're not intimately familiar with how certain things were done in the past, I think the tendency is to superimpose our current methods onto history. In the case of burial, if we didn't know how many people were buried in the early modern era, I think we might tend to picture something like this, with a coffin in the vault in a rural setting with flowers. But almost every element of the scene is a 20th century creation. As I go through the next few hundred years or so, we'll get to see how certain traditions and methods came into fashion that we still use today. In the early modern era, up to the 20th century, funerals and burials were a community affair. People generally died at home, and their bodies were displayed at home for a few days, both to watch for signs of life, but also to allow loved ones to say goodbye, and then it was time for burial. And the naked body might be wrapped in either linen or wool. That actually depended on how wealthy you were. There was an actual law on the books in Great Britain since 1666 that bodies had to be buried in all wool garments as a way to support the local wool industry. However, linen had a certain cachet among Christians because Christ was buried in linen. So those rich enough to pay the £5 fee, which was pretty exorbitant at the time, were buried in linen, like this chap pictured here. You might not think this looks like a rich person's funeral. You might also be surprised to see it's in the middle of town. But part of the good death was to be buried in a churchyard, and those were usually in the center of town, and space was definitely at a premium, hence the charnel houses that we talked about earlier. Buried people in bucolic country cemeteries outside of town didn't become popular until much later. It was in the early modern era too, that the tradition of the wake became popular practice. Wakes took place the night before a funeral and were a social occasion. It was a time where people could express their emotions over the death of a loved one, which would routinely run the gamut between sorrow and fond remembrances and even practical jokes. In this way, the community was able to process their grief and adjust to the new reality without that person. Some still practice waking. You may have heard of it called a traditional Irish wake. Any fans of The Wire might remember Jimmy McNulty laid out on the pool table. That's sort of a waking. But it's largely fallen out of practice now that bodies are rarely kept in the home before burial. The early modern era also showed the rise of a practice that is far less common today, the funeral invitation. These invites, which were popular among the wealthy in the 17th and 18th centuries, showed how the corpse took center stage at the funerals. There was none of the modern euphemisms that we use today. These invitations featured funeral corteges, piles of bones, death, skull and crossbones, coffins, and shrouds. Instead of saying to come and remember so-and-so, they almost always asked that you accompany the corpse at the funeral. One can scarcely imagine getting this sort of invitation today. Moving on to our most morbid of centuries, Doctor and writer Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "No families take so little medicine as those of doctors, except those of apothecaries." The 19th century, like I said, was a particularly morbid one, with so many different major cultural and historical shifts that lead us directly to the way that society views death today. So I'll try to hit some of the major themes along the way. Like fear of premature burial. Throughout the course of this talk, I've mentioned how throughout history there have been concerns over how to tell whether someone's alive or dead before they were buried. The fear of premature burial, though, really hit a fever pitch in the 19th century. There were many books describing the horrors of premature burial and giving many lurid descriptions of accounts of this occurring, but how many of these stories were actually true is lost to history. On this lurid title page for 1817's Thesaurus of Horror, John Snart lists his expertise as being an author of the mathematical principles of mensuration, which is the branch of geometry that measures volume, length, and area. So clearly he's an expert on the line between the living and the dead, and the innumerable instances of, as he puts it, Gothic barbarity of people's descent into an untimely grave, where they experience the ineffable horrors of premature interment. It appears Mr. Snart was a big fan of the exclamation point. Snart echoed age-old fears of judging someone to be dead before they actually were. It can scarcely be supposed undertakers are capable of distinguishing an apparent from a real death. Animals who sleep during winter show no signs of life. In this case, circulation is only suspended, but were it annihilated, the vital spirit does not so easily lose its action as other fluids of the body. And the principle of life, which long survives the appearance of death, may reanimate a body in which the action of all the organs seems to be at an end. Cholera, at this time, posed a particular problem in this regard because it caused its victims to take on the blue pallor of death, with cold skin, rigid muscles, and slowed heart rates and breathing. This image shows a 23-year-old woman before and after being stricken with cholera. There were cholera pandemics in the United States and Europe between 1827 and 1835, which added to these fears. Since the 19th century was also the dawn of the industrial age, many entrepreneurs attempted to cash in on people's fears of premature burial, like this device, which would allow you to call for help by ringing a bell and waving a flag from 6 feet under should you wake up in that situation. But there was something way more tangible for people to fear about death in the 19th century, and that was medical students. Medical school instruction became much more rigorous in the 19th century, and a lot of major advancements were made, but the laws about how instructors were able to procure bodies for anatomical dissection hadn't changed since the Middle Ages. They were only able to dissect bodies of executed prisoners. Soon the need for bodies far outweighed the availability, so medical schools openly hired resurrectionists to dig up freshly buried bodies and bring them back to the anatomical table for study. Some of these resurrectionists were medical students themselves. Grieving families of all social classes had to go to extremes to protect their loved ones' corpses, including holding graveside vigils for days until the ground hardened, bribing church sextons to protect bodies, though resurrectionists often bribed more than that. And again, the new industrial entrepreneurs stepped in to fill the need. Metal coffins came into vogue for this reason, and in 1818 the patent coffin debuted, made of either wrought or cast iron, with strategically placed springs inside to confound would-be resurrectionists. There were also iron bar vaults like this one pictured that could protect a coffin. This particular model became known as the Mort safe. The commercialization of the corpse did not end there, though. The idea of the respectable funeral came to mean one where the new profession of the undertaker was involved. Now, it's no coincidence that the rise of the body snatcher corresponded with the rise of the undertaker, because someone needed to be hired to take care of the dead's affairs and ensure their safety. Soon, undertakers began working with the new urban middle classes instead of exclusively with the wealthy. According to Ruth Richardson, manifest in the increasingly commercialized trappings of death, the funeral came to be the rite of passage par excellence by which to assert financial and social position, a secular last judgment which had as its goal the exhibition of worldly respectability. The process came to full flower in the Victorian funeral. Now, the Victorians are still remembered today chiefly by how they fetishized death through their rituals, through their fashion. They had jewelry made from the hair of lost loved ones, was popular at the time. I'm actually wearing one, so if you want to see it later, you can check it out. Also, the cultural practices like postmortem photography were Victorian creations. Meanwhile, in America, the Civil War completely changed the way medicine was practiced and the way that we dealt with the unfathomable amount of death that resulted in that short time period. Between 1861 and 1865, approximately 620,000 American soldiers died in the Civil War, which is about equal to the American fatalities in all the wars you see listed here combined. And that doesn't even count civilian death, that's only soldiers. The medieval concepts of the good death, bad death, and ars moriendi came back to public consciousness in the face of all this destruction. Soldiers would frequently arrange for their burial plots when they were home on leave, or arrange for trinkets to be sent home to loved ones when they died. Civil War historian Drew Gilpin Faust said, "These mementos served as a way to make the loss of loved ones in the far-off battlefield more concrete." Because as we have established, before this time, death primarily took place at home. And an anonymous mass grave burial for their young men was a little bit too much for most Americans to bear, and certainly contrary to the ideas of a good death. Though various kinds of embalming had existed since ancient times, it was rarely employed until the Civil War. Metal caskets, or even iced caskets, to bring bodies home from the battlefields, but they still encountered many difficulties escorting family members home in one piece. So for those who could afford it, embalming meant that bodies could be preserved long enough to make it home for burial. Poor Oliver Wendell Holmes, who we quoted earlier, he was himself a doctor. He was searching frantically for his son on the battleground of Antietam. He remarked upon the contrast between those who could afford a good death for their dead kin and those who could not. The slain of higher condition, embalmed and iron cased, were sliding off the railways to their far homes. The dead of the rank and file were being gathered up and committed hastily to the earth. Embalming was yet another way that people were able to commodify the corpse, and many 19th century embalmers made a lot of money off of the Civil War dead. You can see the text here of a full-page ad that from an 1863 newspaper of an embalmer sort of championing his wares. When faced with all of this death, Americans in the Civil War began to engage in a kind of death denial that continues to pervade our culture today. But what is death denial? In his groundbreaking 1973 work, philosopher Ernest Becker argues that because humans are saddled with being the only animal that knows it will die, they engage in complex self-defense mechanisms to be able to go on. Humans create cultural artifacts like literature and music in hopes that they will be able to transcend their own mortality and be able to live on forever in some small way. So while this is a pretty natural and healthy response to the knowledge of our limited time on Earth, often the denial of death can be taken to extremes, and those extremes manifest themselves in our culture. So how did this growing death denial manifest itself in the Civil War era? Well, in literature and poems, sometimes they literally denied death. There is no death. The stars go down to rise upon some fairer shore and bring in heaven's jeweled crown they shine forevermore. And ever near us, though unseen, the dear immortal spirits tread. For all the boundless universe is life, there are no dead. This poem was in a popular magazine out of Philadelphia, where just, not so far away from there, people were dying in droves during the Civil War. We're moving on to the modern era, where we'll see that the ever-extending life expectancy and the growing denial of death play out in really interesting ways here. as Borges says, to draw out the span of a man's life was to draw out the agony of his dying and multiply the number of his deaths. The popularity of embalming from the Civil War era continued in America, but it never caught on in other countries among the lay population. It did, however, catch on among world leaders. So Joseph Stalin had Lenin embalmed against his wishes, and he still remains on display in Red Square today for tourists to gawk at, as you can see here. This photo was only taken a few years ago. The list of 20th century leaders who were permanently embalmed for display is a pretty long one, as you can see here. Also, you might notice that a lot of them tend to have reputations as being dictators or despots in some way. Nevertheless, although all these leaders were being put on display, the viewing of the corpse and other traditional practices like waking started to go away in the 20th century and replaced with certain euphemisms like, now, let's remember him as he was in life. That sort of mindset became the norm. Also, the concept of anatomical gifting or donating one's body to science became far more common in the 20th century as well. Part of that was due to some changes in laws in the 19th century, but so now pretty much all of the cadavers that are used in medical schools are donated. Even though there's always a shortage of available bodies for scientific use, resurrectionists are hardly necessary anymore. Lest you think we've resolved this pesky problem of the line between life and death that has popped up in every single time period we've talked about so far, the modern era has its own questions about that distinction. The 20th century concepts of brain death and persistent vegetative states are a result of modern medical advances which can keep people technically alive far past what would normally have been available in the past. The Terry Schiavo case illustrates how contentious opposing views of where the line between life and death can be. Terry Schiavo had a massive heart attack and brain damage in 1990, and after being diagnosed as being in a persistent vegetative state from which she'd never recover, her husband sought to remove her feeding tube so that she could die, but her parents fiercely protested this, and they dragged out a battle in the courts and in the media, until finally her husband Michael got to carry out what he said were her wishes in 2005. Her gravestone speaks to the struggle that was fought over where her life was supposed to end. It says, beloved wife, born December 3rd, 1963, departed this earth February 25th, 1990, at peace, March 31st, 2005. And it says, I kept my promise. As with any scientific and medical advances, ethical issues over how long and through what methods someone should be kept alive will continue to arise. Also, cremation became a popular choice in the West for the first time in the 20th century, and it's rocketing into the 21st century. American cremation rates in 1985 were only about 15%, but by 2010 they rose dramatically to 41%. And by 2020, it's estimated that around 60% of Americans, or more than half, will be cremated. In Canada and Europe, the cremation rates are even higher. Some reasons for this include lowered costs versus burial, secularization or loosening of religious restrictions regarding cremation, and environmental concerns, which I'll return to in a minute. The 20th and 21st centuries in America are characterized by the rise of an extreme individualism. People strive to be noticed as special and different from the time that they're children, and now that individualist streak is extending to the way that we die. Timothy Leary was the Harvard professor and LSD advocate who encouraged a generation of hippies to turn on, tune in, and drop out. He was such a maverick figure in life, it was unlikely that he wanted to die in a humdrum way. His original plans were to be cryonically frozen, but he changed his mind shortly before he died. So instead, Leary's ashes were flown into space on a rocket, where he was the first person to have a space burial. And since then, scientists, pilots, and a few dozen others have followed Leary's lead, including Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry. Never at a loss for words, Leary had a philosophical underpinning for his choice. You've got to approach dying the way you live your life, he said, with curiosity, hope, experimentation, and with the help of your friends. The latest technologies are also being employed to change our experiences with and even provide interactions with the dead. Hologram technology enabled Snoop Dogg to do a duet with Tupac at Coachella in 2012, even though Tupac had been dead for nearly a decade. But it's not only the famous who are seeking to express their individuality through death. There's been a growing trend among certain subcultures, like gangs, for instance, to have their funerals be unusual spectacles, which include elements like being embalmed in lifelike positions, like standing in a corner or on a motorcycle, or being buried in their favorite car. Often the people who choose this kind of funeral die very young and violently, and their choices spark trends in their communities where each subsequent funeral tries to outdo the next. These trends attempt to defy and deny death by making the person look as alive as possible, but what kind of impact will that have on the way that we as a society view and process the realities of death? At the same time, people are thinking more individualistically about their deaths, as Timothy Leary put it, attempting to die the way that they lived. This thought process is causing a growing group of people to question their assumptions about the way death is done in America and what alternatives we have. The writers and death professionals associated with Death Salon are very active in this debate. One of the major ways this debate manifests is the choice between what people now call traditional burial versus natural burial. Death Salon performer and curator Caitlin Doty is a mortician who founded the Order of the Good Death to address some of these questions. She's also the host of a popular YouTube series called Ask a Mortician, where she answers people's questions about death in an informative but amusing way. So let's hear what Caitlin has to say about traditional and natural burial.
A list of things to accomplish today. 1, make a video. Cool, doing it right now. 2, laundry. Boring, but doable. 3, shroud the cat. After the last episode, quite a few of you were like, wait, so what exactly is the difference between a traditional and a natural burial? Which is totally fair, and I should have made that clearer. I just forgot that I hadn't told you before, because in my mind, you and I are our best friends. In the death industry, traditional and natural burial are like the Sharks and the Jets, like Christina and Britney, Obama and Romney, Edward and Jacob. Like, just pick a side already, man. So, spoiler alert, I'm not really an objective party here. I'm pretty solidly team natural burial, but I'm not like a burialist or anything. Like, I totally have traditional burial friends. Oh look, here we are. Traditional burial is more like Team Edward. Cold, distant, aimed towards the long-term preservation of the dead. It involves a body being embalmed, which is a chemical process to slow decomposition. That embalmed body is then put in a heavy-duty casket. That casket is put under a big vault. The dirt is put on top, and then there's a headstone, like a cherry on top of a "you're going to be safe and protected forever" sundae. Before you think that I'm beating up on poor, defenseless traditional burial with that metaphor, consider that in America, for example, right now we have a 40% cremation rate, and the other 60%, not all of it, but a lot of it, is traditional burial. Natural burial is more like Team Jacob, in that it's happening real fast and wild, and like everybody's out in the woods and stuff. And for thousands of years of human history, natural burial was just called burial, in that you dug a hole and put a body in it. Nowadays, it's incredibly difficult, and you guys email me about this all the time, poor dears, to just get a naked corpse, maybe in a shroud if we're feeling fancy, into a hole in the ground. And most cemeteries won't allow for a body just to go in the ground without a big vault around the casket, because with a natural burial, the ground can shift and settle and make it more difficult for them to mow the grass. I'm serious. Growing up in Hawaii, there were always ads on TV for the Olive Garden. Thing was, there was no Olive Garden in Hawaii. So it would be like, oh, the fettuccine, the Alfredo in slow motion, haha, no, you can't have any. For that reason, I feel bad even telling you guys about natural burial, but it will become more available as people demand it, so demand it. plan ahead for it. There are a lot of good online resources, including some at orderofthegooddeath.com, which I will link below. Hey, do you guys want to hear Barbara Walters say cadaver?
Cadavers.
Do you want to hear it again?
Cadavers, 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 cadavers.
So, as Caitlin said, there are some criticisms of traditional burial. What's so wrong with it anyway? Well, number one complaint is that the practice is very damaging to the environment. For instance, when people are embalmed, which almost all people are when they're prepared in a traditional funeral home setting, the noxious substances which are used to perform the embalming, including formaldehyde, are washed directly down the drain with the person's blood. So, formaldehyde is a cancer-causing agent, and it goes right into the sewer system. So that is one of the problems, but what doesn't get washed down the drain eventually ends up in the ground, along with hundreds of tons of steel, bronze, copper, hardwoods, and millions of tons of concrete. Approximately a ton of concrete for the vault is in each grave in a traditional burial, which a lot of people don't know. And these statistics don't come from, some hippie organization. They come from the Casket and Funeral Association of America, Cremation Association of North America, places like that. Another problem people have with traditional burial is the deception that's sometimes involved. Not always, but sometimes. Because most people don't know the history of burial practices or the laws surrounding them. They don't know what their rights are. They're taken at an extremely vulnerable place, and they don't know their rights. They don't know what expensive and unnecessary services they're allowed to refuse. Embalming is the biggest culprit here. Caitlin said in her experience, the funeral industry has done a very good job of masking the option. I get stories all the time from families who were told it's illegal to not embalm a body or to not have a vault or a casket. So for the record, it is not illegal to not get a body embalmed, and it's not illegal to not use a vault or a casket. But your cemetery of choice might refuse to bury you that way if it's against the rules, as Caitlin mentioned with the grass mowing thing. So you can find cemeteries that will bury the way that without a casket or a vault. In different states in the United States have different rules about natural burial. In California, it is legal to do a natural burial, but there's only one provider in Los Angeles called Natural Grace Funerals that does green funerals and green burial. So you really have to shop around. So natural burial, what does it actually look like? Remember this guy? It's pretty much the same thing. It is the real traditional burial in that people have been buried that way for thousands of years. In fact, Orthodox Jewish and Muslim communities never stopped burying their dead this way. Also, embalming and vaulted caskets are almost unheard of in any other country besides the United States. So, what would a 100% natural burial look like? Our mortician, Caitlin Doty, was asked by a magazine to do a photo shoot recreating the process, but with a live person. So, this is how it went. First, the body's laid out, and the jaws held closed, and the eyes shut, and eventually they would stay that way. And the body's washed and groomed, and laid out for viewing by friends and family. After the viewing, the body is shrouded in natural biodegradable fibers like linen. Shallow grave is dug to aid quicker decomposition. Casketless body is taken to the grave, placed in the grave, covered over, with a natural or temporary grave marker to mark the site. Now, there are a lot of strict rules about where you can bury a body. You cannot just bury someone in your backyard in most cases. So those seeking green burial should inquire within their state laws and plan ahead. Here's some additional green burial resources. If you want those links, I can offer them to you later. And so if you're interested, here they are. And then we've been through a lot of information about the history of our cultural customs surrounding death. But if you wanted to hear more talks about specific cultural practices, they could be really wide-ranging and interesting. And we're having 2 public events as part of Death Salon LA on October 18th and 19th in Los Angeles to do that. And so one is called, the Friday night event is a theater-style cabaret event at the Bootleg Theater in Silver Lake. The theme is the uncommon corpse. And there will be short talks and musical performances and short film to address the fascinating tales of certain bodies that would not fade into the background of history. So Paul Kudneris will be speaking, whose photos of jeweled skeletons and charnel houses you've seen in this talk, as will Bess Lovejoy, whose book Rest in Pieces has been referenced multiple times in this talk. And joining them will be Wellcome Trust Research Fellow Lindsay Fitzharris, who's going to be hosting a documentary called Medicine's Dark Secrets. There'll be Green Death Practice expert and practitioner Jeff Jorgensen, and host of the Cabinet of Curiosities podcast Sarah Troop, and even the managing editor of Penthouse Magazine, Christine Colby, will be there among others. So, like I said, a wide range of perspectives. It should be fun, an intriguing event, and advance tickets are already on sale for that. And then the next day, Saturday, October 19th, from 11 to 6, there will be an event curated by the Morbid Anatomy Library in Brooklyn. And this event takes place at the Center for Inquiry West in Hollywood. It's free with donations encouraged. There'll be a Morbid Anatomy anthology book panel with some of the authors from that forthcoming book, including Colin Dickey, whose book, The Afterlives of the Saints, I mentioned earlier, as well as Caitlin Doty, our mortician, and Joanna Ebenstein, who's the founder of Morbid Anatomy Library, Paul Kudneris again, Evan Michelson from the TV show Oddities, if anyone's ever seen that, and screenings of Ronnie Thomas's Midnight Archive. There will also be longer talks in the afternoon with the likes of Elizabeth Harper on the ways female saints mortified their bodies and the cultural implications of that practice. Alison Friend will be talking about Gutra von Hagens' Body Worlds exhibits. And Mel Gordon will also be speaking about a health-themed cafe in 1920s Paris, and we'll have samples of the cocktails they used to serve there. So these are just some examples of the talks that will be given. So if you want any more information about Death Salon, you could feel free to come up to me after the talk or go to deathsalon.org. But I'm most excited to tell you about the event that will be happening right here on the Health Sciences campus in the Mayer Auditorium on October 17th. It's a Visions and Voices event with where I'll be interviewing the hilarious science writer Mary Roach about all of her works, including Stiff, Bonk, Spook, Hacking for Mars, and her latest Goal. So for those interested in sort of the death-themed stuff, Stiff is the curious lives of cadavers, and Spook is the scientific search for the afterlife. But as medical professionals, I would say Stiff and also Gulp, which is Adventures on the Alimentary Canal, would be of most interest here. It should be a great time. We'd love to see lots of people on campus show up. So there's flyers in the back, or if anyone wants to ask me about it. And keep an eye on the Visions and Voices website for when RSVPs open up, which should be in about a week or so. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to fire away. She will be signing books, yes. There will be books available for sale in the bookstore on campus here in the upcoming weeks for the event. And we should have some for sale actually there as well. And then after she gives her talk, she will be available for signing, and there'll be snacks and the exhibit that I mentioned earlier of our rare books. Any other questions?
Is the term "Saved by the Bell" from that invention you showed?
Oh. I'm not sure. I would say probably not, because I doubt anyone was actually saved by that thing. Oh. Sorry to bum everybody out, but I don't think it was a very effective practice.